The purpose of life support is to help others know how to come alongside those who are hurting and suffering. And hosted by Paul Johnson, Senior Pastor of Ridgewood Church in Minnetonka, Minnesota.
Everything you do from then on is different.
One of the detectives, I think his name was
He was
Derek.
a golden boy.
All we can do right now is come together.
Extreme domestic violence, multiple rapes.
I'm so glad you've visited us on Life Support this week, and we're going to do something a little bit different. I'm going to talk about my story, our story, with my wife, Wendi, who's here with me in studio. Wendi, it's good to have you, and it's nice to see a smiling, pretty face. Not that all of our guests aren't smiling and pretty, however.
Thank you. Thanks.
No, you're welcome. Our story is not any worse or any better than anyone else's story. Our story is ours to tell, but it is what we hope will give you some comfort and encouragement as you move forward in your own lives. And really, things happened for us 7 years ago that became life-changing. And so, Wendi, why don't you go ahead and just talk a little bit about the events of the night that you found out that our 21-year-old son, Taylor, had been the victim of a homicide, and talk a little bit about what you were experiencing. I was away from home at that time. I was taking a class, but you were there with our two younger children, and then everything kind of fell apart.
Yeah, so I remember I had our boys, we have twin boys that were 6.5 at the time, and I had them in the tub. And I got a text message from Pastor Rick, our associate pastor at our church there in Canada, and he asked if I was home. And I said, yeah. And I thought, okay, well, Paul's out of town. He must need my help with something. And he said, I'm at your front door. So I quickly got the kids out of the bath, and at least I think that's how it went down. And I got them settled and went downstairs, opened the door, and here is Pastor Rick with 2 RCMP officers. And my heart started to pound really fast. And the first words out of Pastor Rick's mouth were, Wendi, Paul is okay. And that was very reassuring for me, but at the same time, I knew something was dreadfully wrong. And I invited them in our entryway, and I was, I guess, trying to deep breathe and prepare myself for whatever they were going to say. And Derek, one of the detectives, said, Wendi, Taylor was a victim of homicide, and he's no longer with us. So Taylor is our son that was 21 years old at the time, was 2 weeks away from graduating from Nimbus School of Recording Arts, and all of a sudden, my world was caving in, and my brain just started scanning, kind of like a filing cabinet, or I'm like going through photo albums, and I really desperately needed to know when the last time I saw Taylor was. I needed to remember, and so I remember pacing a little bit, and Derek and Rick and the other gentlemen, they were just so compassionate as they just waited for me to process this horrible information. And I went into our powder room and just stood there, deep breathing, and I was like, okay, when did I see Taylor last? When did I see Taylor last? And he had not long ago moved out. He about a month and a half prior moved in with some people, and so he had come by a few days prior to get his mail, and I remember us all being in the kitchen and like living room area, and I remember I was sitting at the kitchen table with our boys. I was working on schoolwork with them or something, and Paul and Taylor were at the island there talking. He was grabbing his mail. Mackenzie was sitting over by the red couches, and I remember when he said, okay, well, good to see you guys, and as he left, I remember we all stood up to hug him, and that was like this treasured moment for me. Tears just welled up in my eyes because I was just so thankful the last time we saw him, we hugged him. I mean, that didn't always happen, right? Like sometimes he would come in and out and we'd be like, okay, yeah, see you later. But that hug is like so precious to me now. So came out of the powder room and came out and just was processing a little bit with the detectives, and they just said, look, it's still under investigation. We want to wait and give you time for Paul to get home. That's the next step. Just you need to tell Paul, and then he just needs to come home from Phoenix, and we'll meet with you both and kind of give you what we know. And so I remember calling our best friends, Mark and Kylie, and just said, guys, can you come? And I told them the short version, and they came right away and stayed with the boys who were in bed and waited for Mackenzie to get home from youth group while I went to Pastor Rick's house and made the phone call to you. And I remember asking Rick, will you pray with me before I called Paul? And so we prayed together, and then I remember calling you and pretty much saying the words that were spoken to me. I didn't want to add to it or whatever, but it was just, babe, I have some really sad news. Taylor was a victim of homicide and he's no longer with us. And I remember you saying, what? And you were just trying to grapple with it. So we kind of sat there in silence for a few minutes. And I think at one point I just kept going, are you there? Are you there? So,
Yeah, it's a confusing phone call to get because you're not really sure what it means at first because you're not computing. And when someone might say he was in a car accident or, OD'd on drugs or something, you can sort of come to grips with that. But when it's murder, it's something that's so far outside of the lines that you can't even grasp it at first. Mm-hmm. And so having the detectives come to the door was, I'm sure, very frightening. And for quite a long time after that, I remember when any police officers would come around our area for any reason, it brought that moment back.
Yeah, and I think of the boys too, because they walked past them on the landing to get to their bedroom. And so they remember that night as the man with the shiny shoes, mm-hmm. right? And so that's their memory. After I made the phone call to you, then Rick brought me back home, and I was able to process a little bit with Mark and Kylie there, but Mackenzie had gotten home from youth group, and she was 13 at the time, I believe. And so I knew I wasn't going to be able to withhold from her for a whole night or wherever. You were trying to get a flight home, and so ended up sharing the news with Mackenzie, and we just spent the night together really weeping, and she slept in bed with me, and we just tried to put on stupid movies to get through the night till you got home. And we knew that we were going to wait to tell the twins until you were home. There's no way I could have done that by myself. And I think from that phone call that we had together, we kind of plotted out who was going to call who. And, you would call our other two kids in the States, and I would call my parents, you'd call Steve, and and so on.
I think one thing for sure at that point, we had no idea what was ahead for us, and we had no clue at all. Not only the grind that it was going to be, but the fallout, the ripple effects, mm-hmm. and even what God was going to do with it. Mm-hmm. Because I think that for a long time we were just numb. But I do remember talking to the detectives on that first phone call. I called them from Phoenix, and their counsel to me was just come home and don't talk to the media. Mm-hmm. Whatever you do, don't talk to the media.
Right.
They're not your friends. Mm. And that was a clue that this was going to be a major media story. And I remember watching the news and seeing stories of with the helicopters hovering over the house mm-hmm. and all that kind of thing. And mm-hmm. that made it a very unsafe for us to go anywhere mm-hmm. or do anything because mm-hmm. we felt like we were being watched and we felt like people were looking at us funny, and it was just a very strange feeling.
Mm-hmm. I remember just having that because we didn't know how he was killed. We just had so little information that our minds, I think we all kind of came up with what we thought happened to just try to get by. But it really instilled in all of us fear. We didn't know if it was gang related. We didn't know if they knew where we lived because Taylor had moved out shortly before. So, we had friends that were coming over. We were putting extra locks on doors and windows, and we really didn't go out. Our church family would get our grocery list and they'd go to the grocery store. It was just too evasive for us to go out in public. And it was in the newspapers, on the news, so we had to really guard from having the kids see anything on the TV and in the papers. And they slept on our floor every night for probably 6 months. Just remember night after night having a kid on either side of us and one at the foot of our bed and holding our arms down at the side, holding their hands while they fell asleep. At times, just kid after kid waking up with nightmares and having to pray for them and pray that we could all get sleep. I mean, as I think back now, I just am, I guess, blown away by all we've been through. And just God's graciousness along the way. It blows my mind. I mean, we still have obviously those ripple effects that you talk about, and we're still living through really hard stuff with our kids and how they're navigating life right now. But when I need to think about how God has been faithful to us and has carried us, it's really important for me to look back and recall those times that he was our helper. And so even providing us with the ability to lean over, hold hands with our kids and have the wherewithal to pray because we were in such a fog, So I'm just really thankful.
That was a hard time because not only were we unsure of anything that had happened, the police couldn't tell us. We knew where, and that's it, because we had to go retrieve his car and so forth, but we had no idea who or why. And it was hard, too, because we were just in shock, and we were in a fog, and we went 8 months before we knew anything. And they were good at contacting us, and I think one of the practical aspects of that is when people are in trauma, when they're going through things, don't expect them to be who they were, and don't ever expect them to go back to being that person. Because you're fundamentally shifting and changing. Your body's being rewired. Your thinking changes. Everything changes during those times. And that was really hard because I was a pastor of a church, and they expected something from me. They expected the St. Paul to come back, and the St. Paul didn't come back. And that's one thing I see as people deal with people that are struggling is there's that expectation that the old person's going to return at some point.
Right, and I also think of just having walked through trauma now and meeting others in different journeys, but traumatic journeys, and just how not only has it rewired your brain, so you're not, left side's not, communicating with left and right, and you're having a hard time at times putting together your thoughts and your words. And even now I struggle with that. And so super thankful when people are gracious with me. And then when others come along and they're like, I'm sorry, I just can't even think right now. Just knowing what that feels like also is helpful. So
I think the unknown was really, really hard. And as the police kept checking in with us, our kids were really, really struggling. We were trying to get our young twins, who were 6 at that point, trying to get them through this because one of them reacted in just fierce anger that really hasn't left. Yeah. One of them curled up in a ball and cried, and they both reacted differently. But I do remember the day after, we lived in a cul-de-sac, and this is a suburb of Vancouver, British Columbia, which is a couple hours north of Seattle. And I remember the sheriff, the police chief, pulled up, who I had become friends with just by developing relationships, Jim Sesford. And he got out of his car, and One of his assistants got out of their car, and then the police dog that they used to help kids got out of the car. And they came in, and I had many people tell me afterwards that to have the police chief come to your house that never happens. And I think even then we were starting to see God working through those small little things that were beginning to happen. Of course, we didn't really realize it at the time.
Right.
But God was already involved with our lives and our story, even at that point. And, the province we lived in had wonderful services for us to help our children and to, help us through the whole court situation later on. But families that are going through things in your church are raw, and you really need to treat them with kid gloves. Show them you love them, but don't force anything on them and don't expect anything from them, because they just can't give you anything at that point.
Yeah. They're walking such a hard journey. And I think part of it too is you don't know who to. I remember feeling like I wanted the world to stop. I wanted time to stop. I didn't think it was right that people were still going about their daily business, because on one hand, I wanted to shout to the world, our son is gone. But on the other hand, I didn't want to tell anyone. It was just this weird collision in my mind and in my heart. But I truly thought nothing should be happening right now. The world should be stopping right now.
Yeah, I understand that. And because your world has been totally turned upside down.
Yeah.
Let's fast forward 8 months into the future, because we were waiting for some kind of a report on what was happening with the investigation, starting to wonder if anyone was ever going to be arrested. One of my friends who had a brother who was a police officer, I'm not sure, did me a real service by saying, look in the trees, look at old ladies pushing baskets. Those are the police officers that are watching over your house. But we finally got a call from our detectives and said, we're going to make arrests on Monday. This was, I think, on Friday or Saturday or something. And they came over to our home and began to prepare us for the next stage. And one thing I remember that you did, each time they came over to our home and sat around our table, you prayed for them. And you would say, guys, can I pray for you? And they they looked very uncomfortable, and they kind of looked down at their shoes, but they never said no. And here they were again. This time they brought their media expert, and they began to prepare us for what would be a week of arrests and press conferences and all of the hoops we were going to have to jump through. But again, God was working, because he led us into some situations where the light of Christ could shine in darkness. And the first thing we had to deal with was a press conference, which was really a surreal experience. But the arrests came the next day. They started the next day, and I think you remember this really clearly like I do. They had us do a video before they left, and it was a video to plead with the people they arrested to cooperate. So it was the mom and dad saying, hey, this is our son, we loved our son, have compassion, cooperate with the police. And then them saying this, don't worry, we've even had to call a parent in, don't worry, this won't happen, we won't, but this video will be very helpful, thank you very much. And the next day they started making arrests, and sure enough, a couple days later, we started getting calls. They're not cooperating. So we really began to get a taste of what this was going to be like, I think, at that moment.
I just wanted to share, I don't know if you remember this, but when they told us that they were going to make arrests, I remember at that point, I don't know if the kids were with Diane doing a field trip or something, I don't know. But I had heard someone knock on our front door, and I was alone at the house. I heard someone knock on the front door, and then I heard someone, and they had a package in their hand. And then I heard someone try to open our front door. And I was so scared. And I tried to call you or text you, but you were in meetings or something and you couldn't come. And so I remember calling Pastor Rick, and Pastor Rick came over to the house and sat in our front living room until I was going to leave to do the next thing I needed to do. But that I was just remembering the fear I felt. And it was not really, I don't know, realistic, what the word is, but it just all was birthed out of the fear I had felt.
What violence did was pull the rug out of security from underneath all of us.
Yeah.
And that violence aspect of it drove home the fact that the things that you can usually explain away, like when you're on a plane and you're getting, it's a little bumpy or whatever, you can say, well, the odds are 1,000,000 to 1 that we'd crash. All of a sudden you don't have that anymore because you've seen the unexplainable happen to you.
Yeah, and I remember I crouched down between our island and the other cabinets in our kitchen, and I was curled up in a ball until Rick got there. That's just the fear that was just gripping me.
Yeah, and there's no doubt that we look back now and we know that we were experiencing post-traumatic stress, and our kids were. And again, it's that violence aspect. I couldn't watch television shows with any kind of shooting or loud noises or anything would freak us all out. It was terrible. The 4th of July celebrations and so forth were awful. But we finally came to the time when the arrests were going to be made, and we began to realize that we were going to have to come face to face with this, not only with the people that did it, but with a court system, and it was going to be really a difficult journey, and we thought we'd already been through a difficult journey. But I think at this point we'd already learned that God was working, and we had already committed this to God, and we'd already said to him that we wanted to take Jesus wherever we go in this journey, and we wanted to be seen as walking in faith. And I think that our relationship with God was growing, even though we were sad and in despair. I remember just crying out to Christ in a way that I'd never had to before. And so there were already things happening that would shape us that we didn't have any idea that it would. And I want to get into that next time we get together. I want to talk a little bit about the way that God helped us during the court battles and the way God has intervened since with our family and some of the struggles that go on with trauma victims and how they have to deal with it, so that as you walk alongside of them, you can be helpful. I'm Paul, and I'm with my wife Wendi this week, and we're talking about our story and as we work through trauma. And this has really set the stage for a lot of what we do here on Life Support. And I just want to remind you that suffering does come. It comes to us all. And sometimes the righteous suffer even more than others, because Jesus told us that the enemy's not going to stand by while we spread the gospel, and the world will hate us. And I know that one of my inspirations is the Apostle Paul. He wrote in 2 Corinthians 4:8-9, "We are hard-pressed on every side, but not crushed, perplexed, but not in despair, persecuted, but not abandoned, struck down, but not destroyed." So don't be afraid. If you're experiencing a difficult time right now, God has promised that you won't be destroyed. He is with you always, and he will hold you in his hand, and you can always depend on him. I want to thank you for listening to Life Support this evening. We're really thankful for our partners here, Faith Radio. We're thankful for Five Stone Media. You can also reach out to us at Ridgewood Church at myrwc.org/life support. And at Ridgewood, we want to take in people that are hurting and help them. I would also really love to have you join me on Twitter at Pastor Paul J. Thanks so much for being with us, and we'll catch you next time on Life Support.